Rob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Well, it's great to be here, coming to you just outside of the DC area.
For our audience, Rob is Senior Director of Business Development at Shield AI, one of the leading military defense technology startups focused specifically in the drone technology space. We'll dive right into the origin stories, the vision behind Shield AI, from its founding to what it's currently doing in the present day, which I found to be particularly inspirational. So, Rob, as you know, the company's founding in 2015 by Navy SEAL officer Brendan Sang was inspired by his experience in Afghanistan. He's overcome those initial challenges and had a seed funding of, I believe, around 100,000 to build the Nova drone that is a critical part of what makes Shield AI what it is today. And, you know, beyond that, there's been this vision of integrating AI into military technology and how it can shape the defense industry, the defense strategy the United States is undertaking. Could you walk us through a little bit about, from your understanding of how Shield AI was founded and those and the early visions that drove the creation of the company?
Definitely. Yes, I think first I'll say a little bit of a disclaimer. I joined the company in 2020, so a few years after the founding. To your point, company was founded in 2015 by two brothers, the Sangs, so Ryan and Brandon. Ryan's the older brother. He had actually started a company that got acquired by Qualcomm prior to founding Shield. Brandon, you have it exactly right, was a former both surface warfare officer in the Navy, which is what I did in the Navy, and then transferred and became a Navy SEAL and served overseas in combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. He actually started the company right around the time that he went to HBS. So awesome that you are conducting this podcast, this interview from HBS. And yeah, so that was 2015 timeframe, but he really went like full time as a founder post HBS around like 2017. The first product was called the Nova. It was a small quadcopter. We classify drones or UAVs in the military by their size. So you have groups
Mm-hmm.
1 to 5, the smallest being group one. So we started out with a group one quadcopter, but the core product has been pretty consistent throughout the history of the company, which is the AI software that actually powers and flies the drones
Mm-hmm.
themselves, which is called Hivemind. So the core product really is that software. It was first, so the quadcopter was first deployed in 2018, mainly to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think one of the key parts of the founding story is just that almost immediately after the founding, after it really became like full-time company, full-time job for Brandon, they were able to deploy product overseas and have a real mission impact. That origin story is still very much with the company today. So now we're almost coming on 10 years here since the company's founding. Core product is still that Hivemind AI technology, but instead of using that software to fly very small quadcopters, we're using it to fly larger and larger aircraft, faster aircraft, and really the main use case that I work on a day to day is to autonomously fly jet aircraft in
Wow.
formations, in swarming types of behaviors. So that's really what we're working on today. But it all started, to your point, about 10 years ago, back with Ryan and Brandon Singh.
Absolutely. And we'll get into the niches of the specifics of the drone swarming technology in a bit as well as we go into this podcast. But what were some of, you yourself as also an HBS alumni, what were some of the interesting challenges from the startup experience, would you say, in those early years, especially when developing perhaps Nova? What are some challenges, especially that's unique to the defense industry, starting something in defense tech? What are unique challenges that perhaps maybe other startups or people getting into this space should think about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think looking back now, had I known how difficult it is to sell software and especially AI software, which is very difficult to understand, even for me to this day as a business guy, if I had known how hard it would be, how challenging it would be, I don't know if I would have signed up to do it in the first place. Luckily, I did because it's been a great run, great journey. I've learned a ton about selling to the DoD and government generally, and then specifically really trying to do sales, do business development, solutions engineering as a new entrant to the defense industry is very difficult. And the way I think about it, the way I would kind of lay it out is that you have extremely fixed budgets in the Department of Defense. So we have basically a 5-year plan is how the department acquires products, acquires technology, and they do invest pretty significantly themselves into research and development. Overall, I think it's pretty widely known that the budget for the Department of Defense is about $1 trillion, which isn't even rising at the cost of inflation or the inflation rate. So
Right.
that budget is fixed years in advance. Most of that money is going towards a select few companies. Probably not saying anything new here. So to really break into the industry, break into the market as a new entrant, you have to
Mhm.
bring a product to market that solves some major challenges for the U.S. and its allies.
Yes, absolutely. And it looks like, Shield AI is doing exactly that in this very important space and very important rising segment of technology that the military is using. So let's get into that a little bit. Autonomous drone technology and AI software. So with the development of Nova, the first product that Shield AI has developed, and subsequently Hivemind, how do these technologies really, do you think, about enable autonomous navigation in uh, perhaps GPS degraded environments, and in particular, Nova's breakthrough as the first AI powered drone used in combat by the U.S. military? What are some perhaps use cases for room clearing or reconnaissance that these technologies might actually, what actually looks like, would you say?
Yeah. So another key part to Shield's origins, another key player really is our current CTO, Chief Technology Officer, Nate Michael, who was a professor at CMU. I think he's still technically a professor, but his full time job is CTO of Shield. And so
Yeah.
you can think of this technology that's autonomously flying military aircraft or military drones. It's pretty similar in how it's designed to self-driving car autonomy.
Hmm.
So you can think of like Waymo, Uber, Tesla, what they're developing. Developed in pretty similar ways. So we use machine learning techniques or like a discipline in machine learning called reinforcement learning. We take a hybrid approach. So the way that we train these drones, and it could be one drone, or to your earlier point, it could be a swarm of drones, so a multitude of drones to perform a certain mission set. The first mission set that we tried to solve, that we did solve, was indoor room clearing, just because that was a problem area, a mission that was very near and dear to our co-founder, Brandon Sang. It's one of the most dangerous missions for a human being to perform in a combat
To
zone is
be,
actually to go break down doors, go into a building. So to the earlier point, if you want to break into the defense industry, you got to solve a really important problem, solve a big problem. And with artificial intelligence, one of the main use cases is, hey, if we have very dangerous missions, how do we do a task or do a mission autonomously so that we don't have to send human beings into harm's way? And that was the mission for Shield when it was founded. It's still the mission, is to protect service members and civilians with artificial intelligence, with autonomy.
mhm.
And so we did it on the Nova quadcopter initially. That same technology is now being used to fly jets autonomously. So for the extremely dangerous mission sets that human fighter pilots have to perform, we can instead send autonomous jets, autonomous drones into those areas.
That's absolutely incredible, and clearly people can see how much of a technological innovation that is to have such a big impact on military operations and enhancing mission success. Going into that a little bit, you mentioned, of course, I assume the Navy, the Air Force. Shield AI has partnerships with, likely elite branches such as U.S. Special Operations Command, the Air Force. Um, what are kind of Shield's AI, would you say, is customized solutions for different military forces? What does that look like when you're interacting with a diversity of mission sets or diversity of military actors, perhaps the US centrics and also its allies? How does Shield AI cater to different needs, perhaps?
Yeah, another really good question. And I think at the heart of the answer to the question is just that software is very flexible.
Hmm.
Software, I would say, is much more flexible in the solutions that it can deliver than hardware is. Department of Defense, not saying anything new here, but has gotten very good and very used to acquiring hardware products, things like aircraft carriers, ships, submarines, jets, even a number of hardware drones at this point. But I think something that's critical for us in solving problems for our customers, whether those are US government or allied governments, is the ability to rapidly deliver a solution, field a solution, and then adapt that solution to an evolving threat environment. So as an enemy, as an adversary learns new tactics, the software, and this is something that's even unique to artificial intelligence, is continuously adaptable to those threats, to the way that the enemy is countering them. And an example of this would just be what's happening in Ukraine. So in Eastern Europe, you have the Russians as a near peer adversary have gotten very good at jamming our drones. So denying them access to GPS, communications, radio links that they typically rely
Hmm.
on to be controlled, to be remotely operated. And so what we've seen too is just an ability with software to update a solution or update the way that a drone flies or the way that it performs its mission in a matter of hours and minutes, vice months and years.
So I think that's definitely really critical. What are some unique challenges you would say in adapting AI powered technology to different military clients, perhaps?
Yeah, I would say one big hurdle, and this is just kind of typical of working with enterprise customer like Department of Defense, is that a new technology, especially like artificial intelligence, like autonomy software, is very tightly controlled by the U.S. government, and so the export laws that we have in place are in place for good reason, because this is one of the major advances that U.S. on the commercial side industry has made in recent years, is just the ability to not only, like I said, field artificially intelligent products, but continuously adapt them and get better and better at training towards some of these complex mission sets. So that's tightly controlled for good reason. That is a challenge for us. So even you could think of like some of the U.S.'s closest military allies, our government is still extremely protective of this technology, of this product, and that presents challenges. But I think those barriers are in place for good reason.
Absolutely. Certainly, do not want the technology proprietarily to fall into hands that aren't necessarily for the best interest of the United States, which of course is the main client.
Yeah, and I'll bring up an interesting one for you. And this comes up in conversations with some other, like I said, very close allies, the U.S. The U.S. wants our military to have the highest performing AI agents. And by AI agents, I mean the type of agents that would be flying an aircraft autonomously. So you can think of like an AI Tom Cruise, an AI fighter pilot. And
Yeah.
so they tend to be pretty restrictive when it comes to how other countries can even train their own AI agents. If we were to export our AI infrastructure, what we kind of call our AI software factory, to another country, there are always going to be restrictions in place into how good, how effective, how highly performant those agents can be, so that they don't exceed the capability that the U.S. has itself.
Certainly, and I think that is also the case in generally broader technologies, hardware even as well, where U.S. would sell its, of course, we're allowed its contractors to sell certain jet aircrafts, but have the best capable aircrafts, the latest variants, be of course exclusively for the U.S. and older versions could be sold, of course, to international allies.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's it.
All right, diving into a little bit more specific technologies and the potential of dual use, there was the acquisition, I believe, of Martin UAV and the development of the VBAT vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. And that was, I think perhaps one of the instances where it is international clients as well. I believe Brazil's defense unit was exploring the ordering of the VBATs and the introduction of drone swarming technology, which is of course for our audience understanding where one operator might be able to operate multiple drones for a certain mission set. And there's of course the potential of this technology beyond military use. Could you briefly explain the VBAT system and the concept of drone swarming and how that's transforming military operations?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So that acquisition took place in 2021. So a little over 3 years ago. We now have a pretty large production facility of VBATs just outside of Dallas, just north of Dallas in Texas. And the way to think about that platform is it's primarily an intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance aircraft. So mainly is used for ISR. It's extremely easy to set up, extremely easy to use. So it's very what we would call expeditionary. So the main user actually has been historically and even now the U.S. Marine Corps. Deploys them off Navy ships, Navy vessels, where the Marines are deployed. Funny story, or I guess interestingly enough, my old ship we used to deploy with about 800 Marines. They now are deploying VBATs, so that's been cool to see. I'll have to get back out to USS Anchorage at some point to see them flying VBATs off there.
Incredible.
But yes, yeah. But the swarming technology, where that really comes into play and enhances the capability of a single VBAT, is when you can train a team of VBATs. And to this point, we've gotten up to one controller, one control system, controlling or commanding three VBATs. So kind of commanding a swarm of three. The plan is to scale that to higher and higher, larger and larger numbers. But even just with three, what that gets you is a much more optimal search track. So when these VBATs, let's say they're out in the ocean, are exploring a certain area, they can do it in a much more efficient way when there's three of them that are autonomously collaborating, that are working together, and they don't need to be specifically tasked by one human operator to each VBAT to maneuver or to change their search patterns. So they can just do it in a much more effective way. We actually just pretty recently made another acquisition of a company based in Australia called Sentient Visions. And in that specific concept of operations, if you were looking for something in the ocean, as everyone knows, ocean's a pretty big space. If you have a team of VBATs that has computer vision software that is integrated onto the platform, which is what we're working on now, it's the equivalent of finding a needle in the haystack. So if you're searching for maybe it's a person who's fallen overboard, or
Mm-hmm.
it's a small vessel that could be transporting drugs or contraband, you can have a team of VBATs that's out there that is flying themselves autonomously, that's just giving an alert to a human operator to say, hey, we think we have so much certainty at 99% confidence level that this is something that we need you to look at, and it can do that very well and very efficiently.
That's definitely a pretty incredible technology already happening. And as you mentioned, you've gotten up to three. And for our audience, people have seen civilian uses of drone swarms in some ways. There was actually a really interesting example in China or in the US even too. There's been this increasing popularity of drone shows in lieu of fireworks or other things. And I think there was one example in China where they had coordinated 10,000 drones. So it's like getting up there, but for kind of understanding how in the civilian side you can use these drone technologies swarming in the sense that you're able to coordinate such large numbers, why is it on the military end of things, and obviously it's more complex, why is that number much smaller, or what is the challenges of scaling up that from 1 to 2 to 3 to 10, maybe 100?
Yeah, I would just say the statement of it's more complex, very true, but that is even an understatement. And so when you see those drone shows, as impressive as they are, they are performing very what we would call scripted behaviors. So everything that each of those drones is doing has basically been coordinated, rehearsed before they've even taken off. To say, okay, you're going to form this image in the sky, or you're going to go and do this specific route. Whereas what we are developing when we talk about Hivemind being an AI pilot is the ability to not only fly a pre-planned route or fly to certain waypoints on a certain course, on a certain track, but the ability to actually dynamically respond to a changing threat environment. So it's the difference between a drone just going from, okay, we need you to go point A, point B, point C. Maybe it's fly around a golf course and you know exactly where you're going to be traveling the entire time, to getting up to the level of intelligence and the level of capability where you can say, okay, we need you to go to this region, this area. But first of all, it's a pretty wide area. We don't even know 100% what you're going to encounter once you get there. Could be any type of threat, could be an air threat, could be a threat on the surface, like an anti-aircraft missile defense system. And we need you as a team to understand your environment, understand your surroundings, and then autonomously make decisions about how best to take out those threats and perform that mission.
That's definitely very, I think, insightful for our audience who might be seeing, civilian uses of drone technology, but the complexities of applying it to adapt to real world situations is definitely really important.
Yeah,
When you're
and
talking,
that sorry to interrupt. That said, I think where we are going, and you even see this in Ukraine, which is the amount of drones that are being used, we are
yeah,
going to that place that you're talking about, where even as challenging as it is to make these the software intelligent and to make the aircraft be able to perform these complex missions, we are going to be scaling AI pilots, not just to three, not just in the tens, not even in the hundreds, but I would say in the thousands is where modern warfare modern.
that's definitely going to be really incredible to be able to see at a certain point. And um, technology is very much so scaling exponentially, especially with AI, the speed in which it's coming about to be, developed. Of course, in the civilian space, you see that. We don't necessarily see that as, of course, as civilians in the, on the public side of things. But no doubt, there's some pretty incredible innovations. Um, to that point, Shield AI also participates in DARPA's ACE program, which is, if you can go into that a little bit, but I understand that Shield AI actually flew the X-62A Vista autonomously at Edwards Air Force Base, and that the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall III, recently recently said that it was controlled by Shield AI's algorithms. So I'm curious about the real time air combat scenarios and the future roles of, as you mentioned, it's not just drones. You're now moving to jets. Can you talk a little bit about the participation of Shield AI in DARPA's ACE program and how that's particularly groundbreaking? And then if there's anything you can share about what this program is meant to be achieving and its future potential for air combat.
Definitely. Yeah. So, right around the same time that we made the acquisition of Martin UAV in 2021, we acquired another company called Heron Systems, a little bit smaller company that mainly focuses on AI software for jets. So, they as a company had really made their name and gotten famous in a precursor to the DARPA ACE program called DARPA Alpha Dogfight Trials, that took place around like 2018, 2019, where you had different companies, including Heron Systems, that were tasked with developing an AI fighter pilot to participate in dogfights. And what do we mean by dogfights? It's within visual range, jet on jet conflict. So the type of conflict that you see if you've watched either of the Top Gun movies, some of the initial
Right.
training they do where you're going up against mano a mano, fighter pilots going at it. So the thinking there was we need the most advanced AI technology in the Department of Defense. What is a great challenge? What's a great use case for us to start out with? It is dogfighting, because everybody's familiar with it, everybody knows it. It's kind of like a sexy problem to solve right off the bat. So Heron
Yep.
Systems won that initial competition that was all done virtually, so in like a simulation environment. And they were flying their AI agent not only against other AI agents developed by other companies, including Lockheed Martin, but also going up against human fighter pilots who were using a simulator to fight against the AI. So that was kind of the start of it. And that, now, to your point, that's progressed from the virtual world, from the simulation world to the real world on this modified F-16 aircraft known as the X-62 Vista that we've been flying on out in California at Edwards Air Force Base. That's been really exciting. It actually took place last year, so last September, on the anniversary of 9/11, was the first time that we flew that F-16 autonomously against another human piloted F-16.
Hmm.
And so that really gets to the core objective, the core purpose with that program is to build up confidence, build up trust in AI flying aircraft, in AI flying jets. And so that was the really exciting part, I think, about Secretary Kendall being willing to actually fly in the opponent aircraft and send a big message, I think, to the rest of the department, to really the rest of the world, that he was confident enough to get in the back seat of that cockpit of that aircraft and fly essentially nose to nose with an F-16 that was being completely autonomously flown. It still had a pilot in the cockpit, but the pilot's hands were off the throttle and it was flying itself. And that's it. Kind of goes to one of the challenges of working in defense and trying to sell to defense is not all the time do we get to advertise or market some of these big success stories or deploying our product in those types of environment situations. But got to give the SecAF a lot of credit because he got in the cockpit, and then we got a lot of great press, a lot of great PR out of our Hivemind AI pilot flying against him.
Absolutely. And what do you think are the broader implications of having AI in control during like live combat scenarios, especially? Like, like you said, this is like, the stuff of science fiction at less than probably even a decade ago, where, you imagine like drone technology, fighting humans in the movies and TV shows. What do you think personally is like the broader implications of having increasing AI control in combat scenarios?
Yeah, I think I'm probably not saying anything new here, but first thing I'll say is that's not really up to defense companies to decide how AI is going to be employed in combat. We have senior leaders in DoD and elected officials who define the rules of engagement for any combat situation, including when AI is being used. That said, I think the department has been using autonomous weapons for a pretty considerable amount of time at this point. We've always had things called like fire and forget type weapon systems, fire and forget type missiles, where just because of the ranges now that we can launch missiles and that weapons can be used, there comes a certain point where it kind of goes into an autonomous mode and a missile is flying itself before it strikes a target. So those have been around for a pretty significant amount of time at this point. I think when it comes to AI, the way that the department is talking about it now and the way the policies are set up is that for the time being, there will be a human on the loop, not necessarily in the loop, but on the loop. And what do I mean by that? I mean that before making a kinetic decision with an AI enabled platform, there will be a human who is getting a notification, getting a buzz to make that prosecution decision before something gets launched or something gets taken out. That said, I think for me, I view it as like a former Navy surface warfare officer. And I look at what's happening in places like the Red Sea right now, where you have literally seconds to respond to incoming threats. And
Hmm.
so the ability to make decisions in warfare in the fog of war at machine speed and not necessarily always at human speed, I think is just something that we have to do going forward as a military. And yeah, like I said earlier, that's just the way that where modern warfare is going. What America's adversaries are working on and doing is incorporating AI into these systems and moving at machine
Yep.
speed. And if we don't want to get left behind, we need to move at an even faster pace.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the clear advantages of the speed of decision making, that when you have machines doing it instead of just a human having to vet through it, it's slower. And I think that was also a part of the premise of the Top Gun Maverick movie, where a key part of it was is like drones versus humans. Whether a human pilot is essential to that. And I think they mentioned like something like if you need humans in there, it adds like 30% of the weight, like weight to the machine itself to be able to have human controls. Um, what are your thoughts about kind of the timeline of like human operator jet pilots? Is it good? Do you think it's going to eventually be all autonomous, or is it uh, there still will always be a human element to some vehicle types? Or what do you think is the transition as AI autonomous technologies become more and more prevalent in more and more weapon systems?
Yeah, I think you will always have humans making decisions on the battlefield in warfare. I think, and what we're working on right now is more like man on man teaming. So teams of drones working with humans, and for the time being, and when I say like time being, for at least like the next 10 years, probably next 10 to 20 years, you're going to have humans working with machines, working with AI. I think what you'll see is slowly you'll see that ratio change, where now you have multiple humans working with one machine or piloting one machine. That's going to flip. That paradigm will shift, and you'll see one human operator that's able to, I won't even use the word control, but that's able to command a swarm of AI piloted aircraft or AI piloted surface vessels, AI piloted subsurface vessels. So I think that's the shift that we're going to see over the next 10 to 20 years. Beyond that, that's probably too far for me to even conjecture out. But yeah, I think you're just going to see even more and more highly intelligent systems on the battlefield.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of timelines for the future, let's talk about Shield AI's growth. Your, of course, very important role as Senior Director of Business Development, and of course, your background in venture capital and how that's playing a really critical role. So, for our audience, Shield AI has raised significant amount of venture capital support. I believe overall there was a 165 million or so round in 2022. There was, I believe, another 200 million raised in October, like I guess like last year of 23, as well as, of course, as you mentioned, Hurrion, Martin UAV expansion acquisitions of technologies also in this space. It's a pretty incredible growth over the last 7-8 years from the founding of the company in 2015, from just now to look at a measly $100,000 seed fund to now a multi-billion-dollar valuation. It's clear that Shield AI has experienced this phenomenal growth with major funding rounds. What do you think are the role, or why is venture capital really critical towards the company's expansion?
Yeah, great question. And just to keep the math pretty simple, I think we can say that we've now invested over $1 billion of private capital into developing this technology, and in particular into developing our AI infrastructure, our AI software factory that is now able to rapidly build AI pilots for different types of aircraft that perform different types of missions. The reason that's important, I think, is that even though the department has a very large budget, even though they invest a pretty significant portion of that into research and development, they are not great at developing new software technology, especially adopting new types of technology like artificial intelligence. And so I think the venture capital community has a very important role to play in just having a different risk profile in the way that they're willing to invest these large amounts of money compared to the Defense Department itself, and also compared to some of the like more entrenched incumbent companies that are kind of just an arm of the DoD or an arm of the government themselves. And I'm talking about like the Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheons of the world. Their goal as a business isn't really to take on a lot of risk and spend significant resources into developing new technology, like the type of technology that we are. That's perfectly fine. I think everybody has their own role and their own place in the ecosystem. But for us, because we're raising from private investors that have a longer investment time horizon than the investors in those companies or the DoD itself, we're able to take some of those like longer term investments, just more risk in trying to develop this type of technology.
Absolutely. And, like you mentioned, there's a legacy or entrenched incumbents, the primes, as commonly known in the industry. Why do you think was the case that they didn't end up developing, with all the resources given, all the tens of billions probably put into R&D each year by these firms, that they're not at necessarily the forefront of AI technology, these new frontiers that um, Shield, Anduril, Palantir, a lot of these new defense tech startups have really been the innovators for. With all the resources given to these incumbents, why do you think there is that contrast?
Yeah, it's something that I definitely was somewhat confused by and wondered about a lot when I first joined and was talking to these companies, because they are massive companies. Even though they spend a fairly small percent of their annual budget on R&D, they still have pretty significant R&D budgets. I think it's probably two things. Number one, those types of companies just have trouble or don't really attract the type of high end, top class AI engineering talent that younger companies, venture backed companies are able to attract and retain. And so I think that's part of it, is just work culture. And that's perfectly fine. I don't think they're looking to change that work culture anytime soon, and it has a lot of benefits to the way they operate too, especially in terms of like safety, airworthiness of the types of platforms that they develop. But I think it just gets back to risk appetite. What is the risk appetite of those types of companies versus what is the risk appetite of a Shield AI or an Anduril or a Palantir? And that's kind of the second point, is the way that we make money is just different than the way that those companies sell and make money themselves. They can, and if you're an investor in those businesses, this is kind of what you're looking for, but pretty consistently they will earn a certain portion, a certain percentage of the annual defense budget every year, and they do a good job of doing that consistently, and they don't have to take big risks or invest in new emerging trends like AI as significantly as a new company like us does if we're trying to break into the industry. And I think for a new entrant like us, you have to solve some really big problems for the Defense Department if you are going to kind of get your place at the table and sell to the department. And so for us, being able to invest significant resources, over $1 billion, grow our team, hire some of the best AI engineers into the world, we're doing that because we have to make a real difference and a real mission impact if we are going to get that seat at the table and scale our revenue.
Absolutely. And it's also, your company's been shaped by the acquisition of additional companies, Herion, Martin, UAV. What is the, for our audience, why would a company acquire some other companies in the similar space or complementary technologies versus perhaps developing their own technologies in-house? For an entrepreneur or for a startup that's growing, why acquire versus developing something in-house?
Yeah, I think it really gets to the heart of that decision cycle and that decision time frame for our customers. Our main customer being Department of Defense. they're making typically like 5-year decisions, in some cases like 10-year decisions. That's a long cycle for us as a new company to align ourselves to, and then to be able to capture that long term, pretty fixed budget that they have. And so, if we're coming in, if we're introducing a new product to the market, and let's say we're doing that next year, so we got a big product that we're rolling out in 2025, a pretty significant portion of the DoD budget is already fixed, has already been assigned to purchasing certain technology, purchasing certain products years in advance. But the way that you can kind of insert yourself at an earlier point than it would normally take. So we don't want to wait from now until 2030 to finally be able to sell that product, because now we're finally in line with the defense budget. We can acquire a company, and a perfect example was Martin UAV. They had participated, competed in a DoD program of record. And right before we acquired them, they had been down selected to be primary performer on a contract program of record with Special Operations Command, with SOCOM. And by acquiring them, we were able to insert our Hivemind technology into a platform that was going to be part of a program for the Department of Defense.
It's definitely a very strategic way to think about it, and perhaps for some people who are not familiar with this space, something new that they've learned. Um, you know, you yourself mentioned DoD is the biggest client of Shield AI. I want to talk a little bit about your role. You've had tremendous experience actually in the armed forces in the United States, to, of course, your education at HBS, and you worked in BC beforehand, where then you were recruited into Shield AI. Can you tell us about, perhaps your role as senior director of business development? What does that entail for people? There is a diversity of roles in a startup, in a defense tech startup, especially. But what is the concept of business development in that space?
Yeah, can change all the time, but I guess I'll just try to simplify it. So my role, really, since I joined too, and still today, is to sell our Hivemind AI software product. The way that I've typically done that, my team has done that, has been to actually sell it as a standalone product in a sense. So even kind of separate from either of our drones, so separate from buying a Nova hardware product or buying even a VBAT hardware product. And so that has been a challenge. I would say like the closest comparable for us and for my go to market has been Palantir, just because that's a very well known company that started out selling their software to the government. They had some major challenges. I think a lot of people know the story that they had to actually sue the government in order to acquire their product, to buy their product, because it was clearly the better product, but the DoD was going to go a different direction if they hadn't been sued. So for me, and we actually had a similar experience earlier this year where the department, if they're going to acquire software commercially, quote unquote, so at commercial prices, there has to be a precedent to where that company has sold their product to another company or commercially previously. This is something that Palantir went through. And so luckily we have sold Hivemind not just to DoD, but also to other companies as a product. And so that allowed us to justify licensing it commercially to the DoD itself. But there's just a lot of challenges when you're going and selling software to DoD that you don't really get on the commercial side. And it's a much different process. So, whereas enterprise sales on the commercial side can be okay, maybe I'm selling something like Microsoft Office to another very large company. Everybody knows what Microsoft Office does, how it works as a product. I'm not going to say it's an easy sales pitch, but it's fairly simple and it's scalable, which makes it a great model. Whereas for us, even as we scale our licenses, scale our Hivemind products, every single application of that product is probably going to be unique and going to be different depending on what platform it's being applied to, what customer is going to be using it, not only what mission are they performing, but which part of the world are they performing it, what is the area of operations. And so for me, it's just critically important to understand the problems that our customers face, and be able to actually develop solutions unique to them, and solutions with them side by side with them.
So that's definitely a very important way to think about it. Speaking of clients and developing that in the future, I wanted for our last segment to talk a little bit about, of course, the broader implications of AI in military operations and beyond. Um, you know, I think Shield AI, as you mentioned, along with Palantir and some of these new firms, are really leading the way in how AI is continuing to evolve in military operations. And of course, there's that potential of ethical challenges a lot of stakeholders make in autonomous decision making in combat and how the company addresses them. And and there are of course potential opportunities for broader applications for Shield AI's technologies for disaster response, as well as perhaps if there might be some for other commercial uses. Um, we had at HBS, there's a class called War and Peace, and we had recently just read about the Cuba Missile Crisis and how JFK and his advisors spent 13 critical days. The book was written by Bobby about the thought process behind the military leaders, from the Secretary of Defense, State, etc., about the decision making to allow for to pursue a blockade of of Cuba at that point in time, and how nuanced decisions around allowing certain ships to proceed through the blockade took about, and that was critical for human decision making process. Uh, in this new higher speed, we're going faster and faster in decision making here. What do you view as some sort of complications, perhaps, or the challenges with the faster decision making, and what is the role of AI in kind of like solving that? Because you need speed, you need to react fast, but sometimes what happens if fast is not necessarily the best route? What do you suppose is that kind of juxtaposition of like speed and urgency decision making that AI plays, and how does the human factor ultimately also come into that, do you think?
Yeah, sounds like a great class, by the way. Wish I had taken it when I was there. Yeah, and I think Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example of still needing humans. Reason why it's necessary to still have humans as part of our decision making processes. I think one of the keys in Cuban Missile Crisis is that there is something known as an escalatory spiral. To your point around, okay, if we just keep making what we think is the next common sense decision, that can actually very much escalate things. And when you're talking about new technology in warfare, whether it's nuclear weapons or something like AI, these are extremely powerful advances in warfare technology. And so we certainly need controls in place so that we don't get into that escalatory loop, escalatory spiral. And so there's always going to be a place for reason minded, clear thinking human decision makers, so that if one country has a process in place where it says, okay, well, we're going to do everything at machine speed and we're going to have machines making all our decisions, and the other side says, okay, we're going to do the exact same thing, then yeah, and there's a lot of science fiction about this, but maybe there is a situation where that leads to a non-optimal outcome. And so you do want humans in there as a control. I think long term for me, and this even goes back to the history of Shield as a company, where has AI and autonomy, where have I seen it play a role and play a really positive role is warfare is a very dangerous business. It's a war is pretty much the worst thing that has been invented by humans. And so if there are situations where we don't have to send humans into harm's way, and we can perform surveillance missions or perform these different types of mission sets and do it autonomously just with machines, then there's actually a lot of human lives that can be saved. And we saw this with that first mission use case with Navy SEALs not having to enter buildings where there could be bad guys with guns on the other side. And to use the example of Top Gun Maverick that you were referencing earlier, that mission set would not be performed today by human pilots. Just too dangerous. I don't care what Tom Cruise Maverick says. So you would need autonomous or AI powered jets to go in and perform a mission like that.
So I think that is the perfect part to end this podcast recording. I think there's a lot for our audience, for those interested in this space, to think about, and definitely very thought provoking about the future uses and advances in drone technology, AI, and military combat. Thank you, Rob, for being a guest on the podcast and for sharing your insights.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for the time, Will.